In the middle of last week, we entered the season of Lent. And I wonder what your associations are with Lent. Possibly it's to do with pancakes on Tuesday. Maybe it's a time for giving up chocolate or alcohol or even meat. Perhaps you feel it's a time for spiritual self-discipline, a time to focus on penitence, a time for doing something which is good for the soul. Physically, we mark the change of season by changing the colours in the church. They're now purple, having been white last week and green in the weeks before. Or maybe you feel that all of this is not really for the likes of us Presbyterians, that it's a tradition imported from elsewhere. But even so, you probably have a sense that this is a solemn season in the church's year, a serious time of year. And if you do come to church with that sense of solemnity and seriousness, then you're probably not expecting to hear anything remotely comic in church. To be honest, remotely comic is about the best I can offer. I'm not going to tell a joke. I'm very bad at doing that. But I'm relying on the Bible to provide a little comedy, and it really very rarely is laugh out loud, hold your sides kind of funny. But here's a little picture which Jesus paints. A wealthy person approaches a beggar in the street. Quickly he summons his personal trumpeter. A fanfare, please. Everybody looks round. Here, beggar, the wealthy person says, I am bestowing upon you a tiny fraction of my immense fortune. How good I am being to you. I'm sure you're very grateful indeed. And see, all these people around are very impressed at my generosity. I'll have a round of applause, thank you. Maybe the disciples would have sniggered a little bit at that. But comedy works best when it shows us something that we recognize, but exaggerates it just a little bit. Of course, nobody actually requests a literal fanfare when they give, but many do look for recognition. The disciples would have seen that. We've seen that. And we've seen the plaques to prove it. Jesus then turns to another matter. He starts to talk about praying, the central theme of this passage. You've all seen them, he says, the people who make a great show of their prayers, who use many, many words, whose prayers are a great performance, who go on and on and on. We've seen them too, haven't we? The people who adopt prayerful poses, who blether on and use words which really mean very little, who make a great show of their piety. It often feels like those who don't do all of that are being judged as being less holy, less spiritual, less likely to be listened to by God. Not so, says Jesus. And to make the point, he teaches the disciples how to pray. And we say that prayer every week. Then Jesus turns to another subject. He's still talking about the expression of faith. He talks now about fasting, caricaturing people who make a great show of it, who tear their clothes, who make themselves look utterly haggard. Fasting's not really part of our tradition, but it doesn't take a great leap of the imagination to see similar things going on. The people who look worn out doing good works. The people who let you know by subtle means or unsubtle means that they're taking on great burdens for the church. And that, I have to say, is a temptation which it is all too easy for ministers in particular to fall into. Not for nothing do our ordination vows include the promise to discharge our duties with courage, faith, and cheerfulness. Ministers should not be going around looking long-faced and put upon. Sorry if I do. A couple of weeks ago, we thought about what holiness is. We heard how Jesus taught that it was really about how we live our everyday lives, about being generous, about being non-judgmental, about going the second mile, about loving our enemies. And here he's giving us more teaching about holiness, only this time it's a warning. Holiness, he says, is not ostentatious. It isn't showy. It's not about being loud. Holiness has no room for pride. It's anonymous. It's discreet. It's never about attracting attention, but it's always about doing God's work for God's sake. If you are holy, and God calls us to be holy, He wants us to be holy, He expects us to be holy, we shouldn't be trying to get people to look at us. Our practice of faith, our service to the world, should point only towards God. Within the church, that's a really obvious and uncontroversial thing to say. It's something we all know, thanks to Jesus. But it is also actually a really difficult message. We live in a society in which it seems that everyone and everything is vying for our attention all the time. We're surrounded by advertising, shouting, "Buy me, buy me." And when you go home, go and look around and just have a look and see how much you have, which has been designed not only for function, but to be attractive, to make you want it. I was sitting writing this in my study, and I looked at all the many books that there are up on my shelves, and all of them have covers that are designed to make you pick them up in a bookshop and think, that looks like a good book, and buy it. Perhaps more seriously, we know that many people in work are under increasing pressure to stand out in order to gain promotion, in order to attract new business, or even just to keep their job by proving over and over that they are actually valuable to their employer. This is what happens when competition, the ethic of competition, infects every part of our lives. We get to a stage where everyone and everything is seeking attention. And the church is no different. As members of the Kirk session know, increasingly congregations are going to be pitted against one another in competition for ministers who we are told are an increasingly scarce resource. And look at the Church of Scotland's digital and print publications, from Life and Work to Facebook and Twitter. And you see that the tone is relentlessly self-congratulatory. It's saying, look at us, how good we are, what valuable work we're doing, how relevant we are to today's society, despite what anyone else says. There's a fine line, a frequently crossed line between good news and boasting. So while at first we might snigger along with the disciples at the trumpets of the hypocrites, we very quickly see that we're a little different. We reason, why put in all this effort if no one notices? That's what Jesus warns against. He says, be generous. But be generous for the sake of the person you are giving to, not for your own sake. He says, pray faithfully, but keep it brief. You know, in the version of the Lord's Prayer we use, there are only 65 words. I said many more when I was describing it, but they are enough. Do not imagine that God pays more attention to longer, louder prayers. And Jesus says, align your life to the will of God. Just don't make a great show about it. To lead faithful and faith-filled lives, we do not need public recognition. God will see, and that is enough. But this still, I think, leaves us with a dilemma. A little later on, Jesus says this, what I say to you in the dark, tell in the light. And what you hear whispered, proclaim from the rooftops. So we might think there is a contradiction between these two teachings. How can we be both modest to the point of invisibility and be effective witnesses to Christ? Surely that requires that we seek attention. The answer is by no means clear. It is a fine line that Jesus asks us to walk. We won't always get it right, and we'll probably often be accused, often unfairly, of getting it wrong. But true faith is never about self-promotion. Real holiness is never about gaining personal credit. It's always and only about the glory of God. Let me offer this thought. We must not be seduced by the lure of success. If in our life of faith we focus on success, we inevitably apply measures which do not come from the Gospels. Jesus wasn't interested in success. He didn't count up conversions. He didn't tally up healings to show how effective he was being. He was often much more interested in being with the people society ignored than he was in influencing the influential. And he completed his ministry not to universal acclaim, but on a cross and in a tomb. If success is our aim, we are working for something other than Jesus worked for. We'd be working, if we're honest, for ourselves. And we know that's not right. We work for Christ and for Christ alone. Amen.